A red dress? How fitting for a gold digger. She froze. The words sliced through the warm glow of the garden lights. Her fingers tightened around the cold glass. The simple red dress, borrowed in haste from the sample room at work, suddenly felt like a spotlight on everything they thought she wasn't. Silk gowns shimmered around her. Diamonds caught the light. Eyes glanced, lingered, judged. Soft, mocking laughter trailed behind half-hidden smiles. Across the crowd, her fiancé, the man who once promised to always stand by her, was deep in conversation, his gaze never finding hers. What hurts more than being insulted by strangers? Perhaps it's when the one you love says nothing. She didn't know it yet, but in minutes a familiar figure would arrive and turn the night upside down. Vivian was 25, but her life was already stitched together from long nights, tight deadlines, and the quiet hum of sewing machines. She worked as a fashion designer's assistant in a small but ambitious design house. Her role was more than just sketching ideas. It was mending mistakes, perfecting hems, sourcing fabrics on a budget, and making sure each garment left the studio as close to flawless as possible. Most evenings, long after the official workday ended, she could still be found in the sample room. The rest of the building would be quiet, the halls dim, but her workspace glowed with the yellow warmth of the desk lamp. Her fingers moved quickly but gently, pinning, stitching, pressing, the kind of invisible labor that made the final product shine, though no one outside the company would ever know her name. Her dedication wasn't always rewarded. The fashion world thrived on competition, and her workplace was no exception. Some colleagues saw her tireless work ethic as an opportunity. They passed off her ideas as their own in meetings, took credit for her problem-solving, and volunteered her for tasks they didn't want to do. Vivian rarely fought back. She thought that if she stayed focused, if she just kept producing good work, someone important would notice. It was during one of those long evenings that she first met Roman. He had come in unexpectedly, stepping into the quiet hum of the studio while she was bent over a mannequin. She didn't recognize him at first, a tall man in a well-fitted suit, but without the overconfident posture she was used to from wealthy clients. He spoke softly, asking if he might take a look at the collection being prepared for a private showing. Vivian explained she was only assisting, but when he showed genuine interest in her suggestions for the tailoring, she found herself talking more than she expected. He listened, really listened, a rare thing in a space where people usually waited for their turn to speak. In the weeks that followed, Roman became a regular face at the studio. He wasn't flashy with his wealth, though everyone knew he came from a family with deep pockets. He drove an understated car, wore classic suits, and treated everyone, from the receptionist to the head designer, with the same calm courtesy. Vivian noticed the small ways he made her life easier, bringing her coffee when she was buried in fittings, asking the head designer to give her credit for a particularly successful alteration, stepping in once when a client was unreasonably demanding. When he told her one evening, as they walked out of the building together, "I'll always protect you," she believed him. They began seeing each other outside of work, dinners at quiet restaurants, walks along the river after dark, sometimes even a shared silence in the studio when she had a deadline. Roman wasn't overbearing or showy. He let her speak, and when she didn't, he seemed content just being near. Vivian's life was simple. She wasn't drawn to luxury, though she appreciated beauty. A well-cut jacket, the drape of silk, the perfect shade of crimson on a dress. Her joy came from creating, from the slow process of turning fabric into something meaningful. So when Roman's family announced they would be hosting an engagement party, Vivian's first thought wasn't about dresses or jewelry. She decided she wouldn't spend money on an expensive gown she'd only wear once. Instead, she went into the sample room at work late one evening and found a simple red dress she had helped design but that never made it to the runway. It wasn't glamorous, but it was elegant in its own quiet way. She told herself it was enough. She had no idea that in that very dress she would be made to feel small. Her friends at work teased her lightly about the upcoming party, but Vivian didn't think much of it. She believed she knew Roman well enough to trust that the night would be about celebrating their relationship, not about showing her off to impress his social circle. She pictured polite introductions, perhaps a few curious questions about her job, and then slipping into easy conversation over champagne. But she underestimated how different their worlds truly were. Roman came from old money, the kind that didn't need to be displayed to be felt. His family had generations of influence, their wealth tied to businesses that had been handed down like heirlooms. They didn't talk about money openly, but it was woven into the way they moved, spoke, and even looked at others. Vivian had heard Roman mention that his parents were traditional, but she assumed that simply meant they valued long-standing customs and family gatherings. She didn't realize it also meant they held a quiet but unyielding hierarchy of who was acceptable in their world. Still, in the weeks leading up to the party, Roman seemed genuinely happy. He asked her what she wanted to drink that night, joked about how many times his mother would try to subtly test her, and promised her they'd leave early if it got overwhelming. She took that promise to heart. The night of the party, Vivian dressed carefully. She fixed her hair simply, wore small pearl earrings, and slipped into the red dress. Looking at herself in the mirror, she thought she looked neat, confident, and, most importantly, herself. But, as she would soon learn, that wasn't the version of her his family wanted to see. But there would come a night when everything she believed in would be tested. The night air was crisp when they stepped out of the car. A line of lanterns glowed along the driveway, leading to a mansion that looked like it had been standing for over 100 years. Ivy crawled up the stone walls. The windows shone with warm light, and inside shadows moved slowly, like figures in an old painting. Roman offered his arm. Vivian took it, though her hand felt cold even through his sleeve. The red dress she wore was simple, neat, and fitted to her shape, borrowed from the sample room at work. It had taken her only 10 minutes to choose it. She believed it was enough. The moment they entered, sound and light surrounded her. A grand piano stood near the far wall, its notes drifting like soft water. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier's glow. The scent of fresh roses and expensive perfume mingled in the air. Guests glided past in gowns that swished softly, in colors as pale and rich as cream. Diamonds and pearls caught the light at every turn. Vivian's shoes clicked quietly against the polished floor. Heads turned. A few faces smiled. Others gave the kind of glance that lasted a second too long, the glance that scanned from head to toe before moving away. Roman's mother approached first. She wore a floor-length gown of deep navy silk, her jewelry subtle but unmistakably valuable. She kissed Roman's cheek, then turned to Vivian. "So, this is the young designer?" she said. Her voice was polite, her eyes were not. "Tell me, dear, do you make clothes or just fix them?" Vivian kept her smile small. "I design and work on custom pieces." "Ah," the woman replied, sipping her champagne. "So, sewing." The way she said it made it sound like peeling potatoes. Before Vivian could say anything more, Roman's mother turned back to greet another guest. The conversation was over. Vivian followed Roman into the crowd. Music and chatter filled the space, but beneath it she could hear small details. The tink of a spoon against a glass, the faint rustle of silk. Roman was soon pulled aside by an older man with sharp eyes and an expensive watch. They began to talk about business, using words and names Vivian didn't know. She drifted toward a group near the buffet. A tall woman in a gown heavy with beadwork gave her a slow, almost amused look. "That's an interesting choice," the woman said, gesturing to the dress. "Red." A man beside her chuckled. "Yes," he said. "Bold. Perfect for a gold digger." The words seemed to land harder than they should have. Vivian felt her fingers tighten around the stem of her glass. "I'm not," she began, but the woman had already turned to speak to someone else. Their laughter carried behind them, light and careless. Vivian stood still, her heart knocking against her ribs. She looked around for Roman. He was across the room, laughing at something an older couple had said. He didn't see her. He didn't see the way the other guests were looking at her, or the way she was shrinking inside her own skin. She tried to catch his eye. She waited, hoping he'd glance over, notice her expression, walk toward her, but his head stayed turned toward his conversation. A waiter passed, offering a tray of delicate pastries. She shook her head. The thought of eating felt impossible. The piano music shifted into something louder, brighter. Guests applauded softly, glasses raised. Vivian took a step back, letting the crowd close in around her. The chandeliers above seemed too bright now. The air felt heavy with perfume and champagne. She thought of the studio at night, the hum of the sewing machine, the smell of fabric, the quiet comfort of work. She thought of Roman standing in the doorway, holding coffee, telling her she didn't have to face things alone. And now, here she was, surrounded by strangers who had decided exactly who she was before she'd said a single word. Someone brushed past her shoulder without apology. A pair of guests walked by, their voices lowered but not enough to hide the words, "How long do you think it'll last?" and "Until he finds someone more suitable." Vivian swallowed hard. Her hand was trembling. She didn't know if it was from anger, hurt, or something else entirely. She moved toward the balcony doors. The cool air outside wrapped around her, washing away the thick perfume of the room. Below, the garden glowed softly, the fountain murmuring in the center. She set her glass on the stone railing and gripped it lightly with both hands. From here, the party sounded distant. Laughter, music, clinking glasses, all muffled like voices through a wall. She let her breath out slowly. But even here, alone under the night sky, the ache in her chest stayed. She didn't belong in that room. She could feel it in the way they looked at her dress, in the careful edge to their voices, in the way no one really listened when she spoke. Most of all, she felt it in the absence of the one person who had promised to stand by her. She turned her head and looked back through the balcony doors. Roman was still there, smiling, leaning in to listen to someone's story, completely unaware. That was the moment it became clear. If he couldn't see her now, if he couldn't hear her silence, then he might never. She was, in every way that mattered, completely on her own. That was the moment she knew. She was alone. Vivian stood on the balcony longer than she meant to. The garden below was quiet, except for the steady trickle of water from the fountain. The air was cool, almost cold against her skin, and it carried the faint scent of night-blooming flowers. It should have been peaceful, but her heart was beating too fast. Behind her, the music played on. Glasses clinked. Laughter rippled through the room like nothing had happened. But in her chest, something had shifted. She thought of walking back in. She thought of finding Roman, pulling him aside, telling him what had been said. Maybe he'd defend her. Maybe he'd realize what he'd missed. But the thought felt hollow. If he hadn't noticed already, would he notice because she asked him to? Vivian reached for the small clutch bag she had left on the balcony chair. Her phone was inside. She unlocked it and stared at the screen for a moment, her fingers hovering. Her first instinct was to call a friend from work. Someone who would understand what it was like to be surrounded by people who didn't believe you belonged. But then she thought of Daniel, her brother. Daniel was 5 years older. He had been the one to walk her to school when she was small, the one who sat with her at the kitchen table when she struggled with homework, the one who told her, more than once, that she was capable of more than she realized. He had also been the one to push her to take the internship that became her first job in fashion. She had wanted to say no, afraid she wasn't ready, but he wouldn't let her hide from her own potential. In the years since, Daniel's life had changed dramatically. The small tech startup he joined had exploded into a global company, and he was now its CEO. That meant long hours, constant travel, and the kind of schedule that made last-minute plans nearly impossible. But Vivian knew something else about her brother. When she truly needed him, he came. Her fingers moved over the screen. "Hey, I'm at Roman's engagement party. Can you come get me?" She hesitated. It felt childish to call for rescue, but she hit send anyway. The reply came almost instantly. "Where?" She typed the address. "On my way." Vivian let out a slow breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She stayed on the balcony, her back against the cool stone wall, watching the reflection of the party through the glass doors. Roman passed through her line of sight once, still smiling, still engaged in conversation. He didn't look toward her. Time blurred. The music shifted again, another set by the pianist. A new tray of champagne flutes passed by. The sound of voices never stopped. 20 minutes later, she heard it. The low, steady hum of engines. Not one, but several. She stepped to the edge of the balcony and looked toward the front of the estate. A line of sleek black cars pulled up the long driveway. Headlights cut across the gravel. The kind of arrivals that made people turn their heads, even in a place like this. The cars stopped in a neat formation near the front steps. The back door of the lead car opened, and Daniel stepped out. He was dressed simply. A dark suit, no tie, but there was something about the way he carried himself. Calm, certain, the kind of presence that filled a space without trying. 2 men in suits followed him, then another from the second car. Vivian felt her throat tighten. She hadn't realized until now how much she needed to see him. From the balcony, she could see guests beginning to notice. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Someone whispered Daniel's name. She caught the sound of it carried up to her. It seemed a few people already knew who he was. Daniel walked through the open doors as though he had always belonged there. His eyes scanned the room quickly, not rudely, but with a focus that left no question about his purpose. Vivian stepped back inside. The cool air of the balcony clung to her, but the warmth of the party pressed in again. The music felt quieter now, though she knew it hadn't changed. When Daniel reached her, he didn't smile. He didn't need to. His voice was low but steady. "You okay?" Vivian tried to answer, but she only managed a small nod. He studied her face for a moment, really looked, and she knew he had already read the truth. He didn't ask more questions. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the clusters of guests, the grand piano, the champagne flutes lined neatly on silver trays. Roman appeared at that moment, moving toward them with a look of polite surprise. "Daniel," he said, extending a hand. "I didn't expect—" Daniel took the handshake but didn't let it slow him. "I came to see my sister." His tone was calm, but there was steel underneath. A few nearby guests shifted, sensing the change in the air. Others pretended not to watch. Roman glanced at Vivian, then back at Daniel. "Is everything all right?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stepped slightly closer to Vivian, a subtle but unmistakable signal that she wasn't standing alone anymore. In that moment, with the chandeliers above and the polished floor beneath them, Vivian felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. She hadn't realized just how heavy it had been until it started to ease. Daniel's voice was quiet when he spoke again, but it carried across the space between them and the rest of the room. "Maybe we should talk," he said, and then, in front of a room full of the most powerful people she'd ever met, he began to speak. The room seemed to grow still the moment Daniel stepped forward. The murmur of conversations faded. Even the pianist, sensing the shift, let the last note linger before lifting his hands from the keys. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I want to be clear," he began, his gaze sweeping the small circle of Roman's family and the guests who had gathered near. "What I've seen here tonight, the subtle comments, the glances, the tone, it's unacceptable. Discrimination and disrespect have no place in any room, no matter how fine the walls or expensive the chandeliers." A ripple of unease moved through the group. Roman shifted slightly, his eyes flicking from Daniel to his parents. Daniel turned to look at his sister. "Vivian has worked harder than anyone in this room will ever know. I've seen her at her desk at 2 in the morning, sketching by lamplight, unpicking stitches until her fingers ache, because she refuses to send out anything less than perfect. I've watched her deal with clients who can't make up their minds, and instead of losing her patience, she listens. She adjusts. She makes them feel heard." He looked back at the others. "Do you know why she's good at her job? Not because of money, not because of connections, because she cares, because she puts her whole self into everything she does. That's worth more than any bank account or last name." A woman in a pearl choker shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to her champagne flute. Daniel's voice stayed steady. "The comments about her dress tonight? The way some of you have decided who she is before you've spoken more than 2 words to her? That says more about you than it does about her." The silence in the room was thick now. Somewhere in the back, a waiter hesitated with a tray, unsure whether to move or freeze. Daniel went on. "You see, you've all assumed she came here looking for something, and you're right. She did. She came here looking for kindness, for respect, for the chance to meet the people important to the man she loves, and you've shown her none of that." Roman's father cleared his throat, his voice low. "Daniel, perhaps this isn't—" "It is exactly the time," Daniel cut in, still calm but firm, "because if I let it pass, you'd go on thinking this is normal, that it's fine to measure a person's worth by the fabric on their back or the size of their paycheck." He paused then, letting the words settle. Vivian could feel every heartbeat in the room. "She is my sister," Daniel said, his tone softening just slightly, "and I would defend her even if she were wrong, but she isn't wrong tonight. She came here with nothing but respect for this family, and in return, she's been treated like she doesn't belong. That is shameful." A man near the fireplace whispered something to the woman beside him. She gave a small nod, eyes darting toward Daniel. Recognition was spreading now, the quiet realization of exactly who he was. The CEO whose company's name was never far from the business headlines, the man whose decisions could shift markets. Roman's mother's posture changed, her spine straighter, her smile returning like a mask. "Mr. Carter," she began smoothly, "we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I'm sure no one here intended—" Daniel didn't let her finish. "Intent doesn't erase impact. You can mean no harm and still cause it. And when you do, the right thing is to own it, not explain it away." His eyes moved around the group, not lingering on any one person too long. "If Vivian were the daughter of a wealthy family, wearing a dress worth more than most cars, you'd treat her differently. That's the truth, isn't it?" No one answered. The silence was its own confession. Roman finally stepped closer, his voice careful. "Daniel, I should have." "You should have," Daniel agreed, not unkindly. "You had a chance tonight to stand beside her, to notice, to say something, and you didn't. That's between you and her." Vivian felt the words like a weight pressing against her chest, heavy but clarifying. Daniel's voice softened again. "She doesn't need your approval. She never did. But it would have meant something for her to have your respect. That's all anyone wants when they walk into a room, to be seen for who they are, not for what they can offer you." A man's voice from the back finally broke the stillness. "And who exactly are you to tell us?" Daniel met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter Technologies, Vivian's brother, and someone who will never stand quietly while people I care about are treated like they're less than." The recognition was complete now. Eyes widened. A few guests shifted in sudden politeness. The tone of the room had changed. But not in the way they hoped. Because for Vivian, the damage was done. She saw it all too clearly now. The quick shift from dismissal to deference, the way their eyes warmed only when they understood Daniel's power. Their sudden smiles weren't about her, they were about him. And in that instant, she understood something she couldn't unlearn. The truth was already clear, at least to Vivian. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. Now it was the stillness of people recalculating. Vivian could feel it in the way their eyes shifted. No longer dismissive, now suddenly attentive, almost careful. The edges of their smiles softened, their voices lowered in polite tones. But she knew exactly what had changed. It wasn't her dress, it wasn't their opinion of her work, it was Daniel. They had learned his name, his position, his influence. And just like that, she had gone from outsider to someone worth knowing. Not because they'd discovered something new about her character, but because they had recalculated her value in the only currency they understood. She felt no relief in their acceptance, only a sharp, heavy disappointment. Roman's mother was the first to speak. "Vivian, I hope you'll forgive any misunderstanding tonight. We're simply protective of our family." Vivian smiled politely. "Of course." A man she didn't know stepped closer, asking where she had studied fashion. Another guest complimented her dress now, calling it refreshingly understated. The woman in the beaded gown from earlier even offered her a glass of champagne, as if the comment she'd made before had vanished into the air. Vivian's heart wasn't in any of it. She thanked them when politeness required it, but her mind was already somewhere else. She caught Daniel's eye. His expression was calm, but she could tell he was watching closely. He didn't need to say anything. They had spoken in looks since they were children. This one meant, "Whenever you're ready." And she was. When Roman stepped toward her, offering to introduce her to another couple, she shook her head gently. "I think I'm going to call it a night." His brow furrowed. "Already? It's barely—" "Thank you for inviting me," she said, her voice steady, "and thank you for the warm welcome." The last words weren't meant to be sarcastic, but she suspected he heard the edge beneath them. Roman hesitated, glancing toward his parents, then back at her. "At least stay for dinner." Daniel stepped forward. "She's had enough for one evening," he said evenly. Vivian turned to the small group that had gathered. "It was lovely meeting you all." Her tone was soft, final. She let Daniel guide her toward the doors. Every step felt lighter, as if she were walking away from a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. The cool night air hit her face, fresh and clean compared to the perfume-heavy atmosphere inside. The line of black cars still waited. Daniel opened the door for her himself, ignoring the driver's instinct to do it. She slid into the seat. The door closed with a quiet, decisive click. The ride away from the mansion was silent at first. The headlights cut through the darkness, and the city lights began to rise in the distance. Vivian kept her gaze on the passing streets, her hands folded in her lap. "You don't have to explain," Daniel said finally. "I know," she replied, but after a moment she added, "They only accepted me when they knew you were my brother." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That says everything." Vivian leaned her head against the window. "I wanted to believe it would be different. That Roman would notice. That he'd say something." Daniel didn't answer right away. Sometimes silence says more than words. When he dropped her at her apartment, he hugged her once, tight, grounding, before letting her go. "You know what you're worth," he said. She nodded. "I do now." The next morning, the red dress hung neatly on her closet door, ready to be returned to the studio. She sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the engagement ring resting in its box. The stone caught the light, cold and perfect. She picked up a pen and a small piece of stationery. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate. "I hope you find someone your family believes is worthy, As for me, I will find someone who knows I already am." She slid the note into the box, closed it, and wrapped the ribbon back into place. By the time the courier arrived to pick it up, her coffee was cold. Roman called that afternoon. "I got the package," he said. His voice was tight, like he'd been holding it in for hours. "Vivian, can we talk? Please?" "There's not much to say," she replied. "I should have defended you," he admitted. "I should have. You had the chance," she said softly. "And you didn't. I didn't see. You didn't look." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry." "I believe you," she said, "but that doesn't change what happened." He didn't call again. Weeks passed. Work was steady. Vivian poured herself into new projects, late nights at the studio feeling different now. Lighter, because they were hers alone. The ache in her chest dulled, then faded. 3 months later, she met someone new. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. A new colleague joined the design team, soft-spoken, quick to smile, and endlessly curious about the craft. He asked her about her process, listened when she explained, and never once asked about her last name or her family. They started having coffee breaks together, then staying late to work on small side projects. One evening, he suggested starting a free weekend class for kids interested in design. She said yes before he finished the sentence. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was something better to begin with. Respect. And, for the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen. The studio felt different these days. Vivian still worked long hours, but there was no shadow of expectation from anyone outside those walls. No pressure to fit into a world that wasn't hers. The hum of sewing machines and the soft rustle of fabric were her comfort now, not her escape. It was on a Wednesday morning, while she was reviewing sketches over coffee, that the new hire arrived. His name was Thomas. He carried a worn leather satchel and wore a shirt with rolled-up sleeves, as if he'd been in a hurry to get here but wanted to be ready to work. "Vivian?" he asked, pausing at her desk. His voice was warm, curious. "Yes," she said, smiling. "I've heard your name more than a few times already," he told her. "Apparently, you're the one who makes the impossible happen around here." She laughed softly. "I don't know about impossible, but I like a challenge." Over the next few weeks, Thomas settled into the team easily. He wasn't flashy. He didn't dominate meetings. Instead, he listened. When he asked questions, they were about the work, the fabric, the patterns, the little details that could change a design from good to remarkable. Vivian noticed something else about him. He never seemed to be in a rush to talk about himself. She learned, eventually, that he'd worked at several small ateliers before this one. He'd traveled a bit, lived modestly, and saved most of what he earned to support his younger sister through school. One evening, they were the last two in the studio. The others had left hours earlier, but they both stayed, finishing separate projects in companionable silence. The only sound was the quiet hum of the iron and the soft tapping of rain against the windows. Thomas broke the silence first. "Do you ever feel like you could do more than just make clothes for people who can afford them?" Vivian looked up. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but fashion is expensive. Not just for the people who buy it, but for the people who make it." He nodded slowly. "What if we could change that, at least for a few people? There's a community center a few blocks from here. They've been trying to start after-school programs for kids who don't have a lot. I was thinking, what if we taught them? Design, sewing, whatever they want to learn." The idea landed in her chest like a spark. "Free classes?" "Free classes," he confirmed. "We could use leftover fabric from the studio, old machines from thrift shops, teach them the basics, let them make something that's theirs." Vivian felt herself smiling. It wasn't just a nice idea, it felt right. "When do we start?" 2 weeks later, they stood in a cramped but bright room at the community center. The tables were mismatched, the chairs worn, but the sunlight pouring through the windows made everything glow. A row of second-hand sewing machines lined one wall. Piles of fabric, some patterned, some plain, filled the bins in the corner. The first class was small, 7 kids ranging from 8 to 15. Some were shy, others bursting with energy, all of them curious. Vivian started by showing them how to thread a machine. Thomas helped one boy who was struggling with the foot pedal. A girl in a faded hoodie asked if she could make a dress for her little sister's birthday. By the end of the afternoon, the room was filled with the hum of sewing machines, the sound of scissors cutting fabric, and bursts of laughter when something went wrong, which it often did. But mistakes didn't matter here. Vivian moved between the tables, crouching to help, praising small victories, A straight seam, a well-cut sleeve, a brave choice of color. She caught herself laughing more than she had in months. When the class ended, a boy with messy hair handed her a crookedly sewn pillow. "It's for you," he said. She took it, touched by the uneven stitches. "It's perfect," she told him, and she meant it. The classes became a weekly tradition. Every Saturday, Vivian and Thomas would arrive early to set up. The kids would run in, chattering about what they wanted to make next. Sometimes they worked on clothes, sometimes bags, sometimes just experiments with scraps. The room was always loud, always messy, and always full of life. One afternoon, as she watched two of the youngest girls help each other hem a skirt, Vivian felt something deep in her chest. It was the same joy she'd always felt in creating, but now it was doubled, because she was passing it on. She realized she didn't think about Roman anymore. Not with bitterness, not with longing. He was simply part of the past. After class, she and Thomas would often linger, cleaning up together. They'd talk about ideas for the next week, or about nothing at all. It was easy, comfortable. One evening, as they locked up, Thomas paused. "You know," he said, "I don't care if anyone here knows what kind of car I drive, or what my bank account looks like, but I care if they know I showed up for them." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "That's how it should be," she said quietly. Months passed. The class grew. They moved to a bigger room, got more machines, more fabric donations. Parents began to drop by, curious, sometimes staying to watch their kids work. On the last day of the summer session, the kids held a small fashion show in the courtyard. They modeled their creations, uneven hems, mismatched patterns, and all, walking proudly while their friends cheered. Vivian stood at the edge watching them. Her heart was full. She thought about all the rooms she'd stood in where people had decided her worth before she opened her mouth. She thought about the moment she walked out of that mansion and chose herself, and she knew now, without question, the right people never needed proof of her value. They saw it, they respected it, they built with it, not against it. The person worth loving will never need to measure your value in wealth. They'll already know it's in who you are. The afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows, casting long, warm stripes across the sewing tables. The room buzzed with chatter and the rhythmic hum of machines. Vivian stood in the center, wearing the same simple red dress she had worn that night months ago. It no longer felt like borrowed armor. It felt like hers. Around her, the children held up the pieces they had made. Skirts with bright patterns, shirts stitched with care, little dresses with uneven hems but big, proud smiles. One girl tugged on Vivian's hand. "Miss Vivian, look, I made this all by myself." Vivian crouched down, smoothing the fabric between her fingers. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Thomas leaned against the doorway, watching quietly. The air smelled faintly of fabric and thread, but also of something less tangible, hope. As the children laughed and compared their work, Vivian realized she hadn't thought of that mansion, or the whispers, or the looks in a very long time. She remembered them, but they no longer held weight. Her voice was steady when she spoke to the group. "The truth is, love and respect don't come with a price tag. They're not things you earn by proving your worth. They're given freely by people who see you for who you are." Some of the older kids nodded, as if tucking those words away for later. Vivian smiled. "And each of you is already enough, always." She looked around at the faces, the colors, the light, and felt something settle inside her, a deep, quiet certainty. If this story touched you, share it with someone who doubts their own worth, so they'll know they've always been enough.